the silversmith rode through darkness with a secret that would shatter an empire. Paul Revere's horse thundered across the countryside on the night of April 18, 1775, carrying a warning that British regulars were marching to seize colonial weapons and arrest patriot leaders. Within hours, farmers would face the most powerful military force on earth, with nothing but hunting muskets and rage. No one knew it yet, but the world's balance of power was about to shift on a village green barely large enough for a Sunday market. General Thomas Gage had a problem. As military governor of Massachusetts, he sat in Boston surrounded by 3,500 of the king's finest troops, yet he could barely control the city, let alone the rebellious countryside beyond. The colonists had been stockpiling weapons in Concord, a town 20 miles northwest of Boston. Worse, intelligence reports confirmed that Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the two most wanted men in Massachusetts, were hiding in nearby Lexington. Gage decided to solve both problems in one swift nighttime operation. He would send 700 elite soldiers to arrest the rebel leaders and destroy the weapons cache before the colonists could react. It was a sound military plan. It would also trigger a war. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith received his orders on April 18th. He would lead the expedition with Major John Pitcairn commanding the advance units. The soldiers were told they would march at night to maintain surprise. Gage had thought of everything, even ordering officers to prevent any colonists from leaving Boston to raise the alarm. But the Patriots had their own intelligence network, more sophisticated than the British realized. When the Redcoats began assembling on Boston Common that evening, watchers immediately understood what was happening. Dr. Joseph Warren, a key Patriot organizer, dispatched 2 riders by different routes. Paul Revere would row across the Charles River and ride through Charlestown. William Dawes would talk his way past guards at Boston Neck and take the land road. One of them had to get through. The Old North Church sexton climbed the steeple stairs carrying 2 lanterns. This was the prearranged signal. 2 lights meant the British were crossing the Charles River by boat, the fastest route to Lexington. Revere saw the signal from across the water, confirmation of what he already suspected. He mounted his horse, borrowed from Deacon John Larkin, and began his famous ride around 11 p.m. The British had soldiers patrolling the roads, but Revere knew the countryside intimately. He galloped through Charlestown, then Medford, then Menotomy, shouting warnings at every house. The countryside began to wake. Church bells rang, drums beat. Minutemen grabbed their muskets and powder horns. Revere reached Lexington around midnight and found the house where Adams and Hancock were staying. A guard initially told him to stop making noise, insisting that people were trying to sleep. Revere's response has echoed through history. "Noise! You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out." Adams reportedly understood immediately, saying to Hancock, "What a glorious morning this is." He wasn't talking about the weather. He was talking about the arrival of the confrontation he had long predicted. Dawes arrived shortly after, having successfully navigated the land route. The 2 rebel leaders began preparing to flee. Revere and Dawes decided to continue toward Concord to warn the people there. They were joined by Samuel Prescott, a young doctor who happened to be returning from visiting his fiancée. This turned out to be fortunate. As the 3 riders approached Lincoln, British patrol officers emerged from the shadows and surrounded them. Prescott, knowing the local terrain better than his companions, jumped his horse over a stone wall and escaped to warn Concord. Dawes turned back toward Lexington. Revere was captured. The officers interrogated him roughly, even threatening to blow his brains out, but eventually released him without his horse. He walked back to Lexington just as British advance units were arriving. The most famous midnight ride in American history had succeeded, even though the rider never completed his intended route. Captain John Parker commanded the Lexington militia. He was 45 years old, a veteran of the French and Indian War, and dying of tuberculosis, though he would not let that stop him from mustering his men. Around 1 a.m. on April 19th, He assembled approximately 130 militiamen on Lexington Green after receiving Revere's warning. They waited in the cold for hours, but no British troops appeared. Some men went home. Others retired to Buckman Tavern for warmth and refreshment. Parker dismissed most of the company around 3:30 a.m., telling them to be ready to reassemble when the alarm sounded again. He kept a few scouts watching the road. The British column was moving slower than expected. Lieutenant Colonel Smith was a corpulent officer, neither particularly energetic nor decisive. His troops had to wade through Back Bay's marshes to reach their boats, soaking their feet in powder. The river crossing took longer than planned. By the time the column formed up in Cambridge and began marching, any hope of surprise had evaporated. Smith began to suspect something was wrong when he noticed houses were lit up despite the late hour. He sent a messenger back to Boston requesting reinforcements, a decision that acknowledged his mission was already compromised. Major Pitcairn commanded 6 light infantry companies that formed the expedition's vanguard. These were the Army's elite troops, trained for rapid movement and skirmishing. Around 4:30 a.m., as dawn began to break, they approached Lexington at quick march. Thaddeus Bowman, one of Parker's scouts, spotted them and raced back to raise the alarm. The church bell rang. Drums beat the call to arms. Men poured out of houses and the tavern, hastily forming ranks on the green. Captain Parker faced an impossible tactical situation. He had perhaps 70 men formed up, though accounts vary. Pitcairn had over 200 trained regulars. Parker's men were farmers and craftsmen, many middle-aged, some elderly. They had muskets, but little ammunition and no artillery. The logical choice was to disperse and avoid confrontation. Yet Parker understood what this moment meant. If his men ran without a fight, the rebellion might die of humiliation. If they stood and fought, they would be massacred, but they would also make a statement that could ignite a colony. He reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The British light infantry spread into battle formation as they entered the green. Pitcairn rode forward, shouting orders for the Colonials to disperse. Accounts differ on his exact words, but the meaning was clear. Leave now, or face the consequences. Parker recognized the futility of resistance. He ordered his men to disperse, though he probably did not order them to lay down their arms, as some British accounts later claimed. The militiamen began to scatter, but they moved slowly, reluctantly, still holding their weapons. The British soldiers were keyed up after an all-night march, pumped with adrenaline, eager to teach these rebels a lesson. Then someone fired. History has never definitively determined who pulled that trigger. It might have been a British soldier, nervous and trigger-happy. It might have been a colonial militiaman, refusing to back down. It might have been someone on the sidelines, deliberately trying to provoke conflict. The shot rang out in the cold morning air, and for a moment, everyone froze. Then the dam broke. British soldiers began firing without orders. Pitcairn rode among them, striking muskets upward with his sword, shouting at them to stop, but the volleys continued. Colonial militiamen fired back, their shots wild and ineffective. The skirmish lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt longer to those involved. When the smoke cleared, 8 Colonials lay dead on the green. Jonas Parker, no relation to John. Samuel Hadley, Caleb Harrington, Jonathan Harrington, Robert Monroe, Isaac Mosey, Asahel Porter, and John Brown. 10 more were wounded. Jonathan Harrington managed to crawl to his house, dying on his own doorstep as his horrified wife watched. The British had 1 soldier wounded and Pitcairn's horse hit by 2 bullets. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The British soldiers let out 3 victory cheers and fired a celebratory volley. Lieutenant Colonel Smith finally arrived and managed to restore order. The column reformed and marched toward Concord, leaving the dead and wounded behind. The Americans began the grim work of caring for casualties and mourning their dead. But the news of what happened on Lexington Green was already spreading faster than the British could march. Every mile between Lexington and Concord, riders carried the story to surrounding towns. The message was no longer a warning about British troop movements. It was a call for vengeance. The British reached Concord around 7 a.m. Colonel Smith deployed his men methodically. He sent companies to secure the north and south bridges that crossed the Concord River. Other units began searching the town for hidden weapons. The people of Concord, forewarned by Samuel Prescott hours earlier, had spent the night hiding or destroying their military supplies. The British found some weapons, flour, and wooden gun carriages, which they burned in the town square. But the vast majority of the arsenal had been moved or concealed. The mission was already a failure, even before the fighting started. Captain Walter Laurie commanded the companies guarding the North Bridge. He watched with growing concern as Colonial militia companies gathered on the hills beyond the bridge. The smoke from the fires in town square rose into the morning sky, visible for miles. More and more Minutemen were arriving every minute, drawn by the alarm that had been spreading since midnight. Companies came from Concord, Acton, Lincoln, Bedford, and other surrounding towns. By mid-morning, nearly 400 militiamen had assembled, outnumbering Laurie's detachment. Colonel James Barrett commanded the gathering American forces. He was 64 years old, a respected leader and farmer. Unlike Captain Parker at Lexington, Barrett had numerical superiority and better tactical position. He held a council of war on the hillside. The officers debated. Should they attack the British at the bridge? Some urged caution. Others pointed out that the British were burning the town. Smoke continued to rise, and some mistakenly believed entire buildings were being torched rather than just military supplies. The mood shifted from defensive to aggressive. Around 10 a.m., Barrett ordered his men to advance toward the North Bridge. They moved in formation, an orderly column with the Acton militia in front. Captain Isaac Davis led the Acton men, having been given the place of honor because his company was the only one with bayonets. The British at the bridge watched the Americans approaching in disbelief. Captain Laurie sent messengers requesting reinforcements, but Colonel Smith was still in town coordinating the search operations. Laurie's men were on their own. The British regulars began falling back across the bridge in increasingly poor order. Some soldiers started tearing up the bridge planks to slow the American advance. This panicked action may have convinced the Americans that the British intended to trap them on the wrong side of the river. When British officers ordered their men to form defensive positions on the east side of the bridge, the troops rushed to comply. In the confusion, shots rang out. Again, historians debate who fired first, but the British likely shot initially, aiming at the American officers leading the column. Captain Davis fell dead, shot through the heart. Abner Hosmer, standing near him, was killed instantly by the same volley. The Americans fired back, this time in disciplined volleys rather than scattered shots. They had the advantage of numbers and position. British soldiers began falling. 2 redcoats died almost immediately. 4 officers were wounded, including Captain Laurie himself. The British line broke. The regulars retreated toward Concord in disorder, leaving their dead behind. Some wounded soldiers were left on the ground, too injured to move. The Battle of Concord Bridge lasted only 2 or 3 minutes, but its significance far exceeded its duration. For the first time, Colonial militiamen had faced British regulars in formal combat and won. The Americans had advanced under fire, maintained formation, delivered controlled volleys, and forced professional soldiers to retreat. The myth of British invincibility shattered on that bridge. More importantly, the tactical situation had reversed. The British were now surrounded in enemy territory, miles from safety, with Colonial forces multiplying by the hour. Colonel Smith realized his predicament. He had accomplished nothing meaningful. The weapons cache had mostly escaped capture. His men were exhausted from marching all night. Wounded soldiers needed medical attention, and the countryside was swarming with angry militiamen. He ordered a retreat to Boston around noon. The return march would become a nightmare that British soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. The Americans did not fight the retreat as a conventional battle. They fought it as an ambush, using tactics they had learned fighting Native Americans during earlier conflicts. Militiamen hid behind stone walls, trees, houses, and barns. They let the British column pass, then fired into the rear guard. They aimed specifically at officers, easily identified by their uniforms and swords. They reloaded and moved to new positions, appearing ahead of the British column again and again. The Redcoats, trained for European-style warfare, were psychologically unprepared for this style of combat. They could not see their enemy. They could not form battle lines. They could only march and die. The retreat became increasingly chaotic as it progressed. British soldiers began breaking ranks to chase militiamen who had fired on them, only to be ambushed by other militia units. Houses suspected of harboring snipers were searched and sometimes looted in retaliation. Several Colonial civilians were killed during these searches. The violence was escalating beyond military engagement into something uglier. Officers lost control of their men. Wounded soldiers staggered along, trying to keep up with the column. The dead were left behind. At Lexington, the situation nearly became catastrophic. The British were running out of ammunition and collapsing from exhaustion. Then salvation appeared. Lord Hugh Percy arrived with approximately 1,000 fresh troops and 2 artillery pieces. Percy had marched from Boston that morning after receiving Smith's request for reinforcements. He deployed his brigade across Lexington Green, set up his cannon and provided covering fire while Smith's battered column retreated through his lines. The artillery proved decisive. When Colonial militiamen attempted to press their attack, cannonballs scattered them. Percy's men formed a defensive perimeter, allowing Smith's troops to rest briefly and redistribute ammunition. But Percy now faced the same problem Smith had confronted, getting back to Boston through hostile territory with an enormous target painted on his back. The combined British force, now about 1,700 soldiers, resumed the retreat around 3:30 p.m. The fighting continued all the way to Charlestown. Militia companies from towns throughout eastern Massachusetts converged on the route. By late afternoon, perhaps 3,800 militiamen were engaged in the running battle. They fired from every conceivable position. British casualties mounted steadily. Percy demonstrated better tactical skill than Smith. He deployed flanking parties to clear buildings and walls ahead of the main column. He used his artillery effectively to suppress enemy fire. He maintained discipline, preventing his troops from breaking ranks to pursue individual attackers. But even good tactics could not prevent losses when thousands of angry militiamen controlled the terrain. The last miles into Charlestown were the bloodiest. British soldiers were literally running, abandoning all semblance of military order, just trying to reach the safety of the Royal Navy's guns. The British column finally reached Charlestown around sunset. They collapsed under the protection of HMS Somerset's cannons, which dominated the peninsula and prevented the militiamen from pursuing further. The Americans took positions on the hills surrounding Charlestown, effectively besieging the British forces there. As darkness fell, both sides assessed what had happened. The statistics told a stark story. 73 British soldiers killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. American casualties were much lighter, 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. But numbers alone could not capture the day's significance. News of the battle spread through the colonies with astonishing speed. Riders carried accounts south to New York and Philadelphia, north to New Hampshire and beyond. Within days, the story had reached every major town in the 13 colonies. Within weeks, it had crossed the Atlantic. The narrative varied depending on who told it. American accounts emphasized British aggression at Lexington and atrocities during the retreat. British accounts emphasized colonial treachery and ambush tactics. Both sides shaped the story to support their political goals. But everyone agreed on the essential fact: shooting had started, men had died, and there was no turning back. The political consequences proved even more significant than the military results. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress immediately began raising an army. Within days, thousands of militiamen from across New England descended on Boston, forming a siege line that would last nearly a year. Other colonies began preparing for war. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, had to decide whether to support Massachusetts or seek reconciliation with Britain. Many delegates still hoped for peace, but the blood spilled on April 19th made compromise increasingly difficult. King George III received news of Lexington and Concord in late May. His response was uncompromising. He declared Massachusetts to be in rebellion and began sending massive reinforcements to America. In August, he proclaimed that all 13 colonies were in revolt. Parliament passed the Prohibitory Act, essentially declaring war on the colonies and authorizing the Royal Navy to seize American ships. The British government convinced itself that a show of overwhelming force would quickly crush the rebellion. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The colonists had learned critical lessons from April 19th. They learned that British regulars could be beaten if engaged with proper tactics. They learned that militia units, despite their lack of formal training, could effectively harass conventional forces using terrain and local knowledge. They learned that they could mobilize thousands of men in hours through their alarm system. Most importantly, they learned that they were willing to fight and die rather than submit. The psychological transformation was profound. Men who had considered themselves loyal British subjects 1 week earlier now viewed the Redcoats as foreign invaders. Military historians debate whether the British could have avoided disaster at Lexington and Concord. Some argue that Gage's intelligence was poor and his planning flawed. Others contend that any mission to seize weapons and arrest leaders was bound to fail once the alarm system activated. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Better execution might have reduced casualties, but the fundamental strategic problem was insoluble. You cannot govern people by force when they outnumber your troops hundreds to one and control the territory. The British would spend the next 8 years learning this lesson at enormous cost. The phrase, "the shot heard round the world," comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson's Concord hymn, written in 1837 for the dedication of a monument at the North Bridge. Emerson was being literal, not metaphorical. The news of Lexington and Concord reverberated through the Atlantic world, influencing revolutions and independence movements for decades afterward. French intellectuals watched with fascination as colonists implemented Enlightenment ideals about liberty and self-government. When France itself erupted in revolution 14 years later, many participants explicitly referenced the American example. The same pattern repeated across Latin America in the early 19th century. Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin both studied the American Revolution as they planned their own independence campaigns. Back in Massachusetts, the immediate practical problem was what to do with an army of militiamen surrounding Boston. No one had planned for a sustained military campaign. The soldiers had left their farms and shops, expecting to return home after a few days. Now they found themselves besieging a city held by the British Army. They needed organization, supplies, training, and leadership. The Continental Congress responded by creating the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington arrived in Cambridge on July 3, 1775, and began the enormous task of transforming militia units into a professional army. The men who fought at Lexington and Concord became the nucleus of that force. The British never returned to Concord. They evacuated Boston itself in March 1776, sailing to Halifax with hundreds of Loyalist refugees. The war moved to other colonies, other cities, other battlefields. But April 19, 1775, remained the pivot point. Everything before was political disagreement and protest. Everything after was war. The transformation happened in less than 24 hours, in a series of confused skirmishes that neither side had planned or wanted, triggered by a shot that no one could definitively identify. History often works this way, not through grand designs, but through cascading accidents that become inevitable only in hindsight. The graves on Lexington Green and at the Old North Bridge in Concord became immediate pilgrimage sites. The dead men were transformed into martyrs for liberty almost before they were buried. Their families received public support and honor. Towns erected monuments. Orators invoked their names. The process of myth-making began while the war still raged. This was necessary for maintaining morale and unity, but it also simplified and sanitized what had actually happened. The real men who died on April 19th were complex individuals with families, debts, doubts, and very human motivations. Some were committed patriots. Others probably just responded to the alarm bell and found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong moment. All of them, regardless of their politics, ended up dead or wounded because a silversmith rode through the night and British officers could not control their men. 250 years later, the battles of Lexington and Concord remain central to American identity. Every school child learns about Paul Revere's ride, the shot heard round the world, and the embattled farmers who stood at Concord Bridge. The events have been painted, sculpted, poeticized, and dramatized countless times. Lexington Green and Concord's North Bridge are preserved as national historical sites, visited by thousands annually. Patriots' Day, a state holiday in Massachusetts and Maine, commemorates April 19th each year. The Boston Marathon traditionally runs on Patriots' Day, connecting contemporary athletic achievement with revolutionary sacrifice. The essential question remains, why did it happen? Historians have offered countless explanations. Economic theories emphasize British taxation and trade restrictions. Political theories focus on competing concepts of representation and sovereignty. Social theories explore how colonial society had evolved differently from British society. Cultural theories examine how Americans developed a distinct identity separate from Britain. All these factors contributed, but none fully explains why tens of thousands of people risked everything to fight the world's most powerful empire. Perhaps the answer lies in something simpler and more profound. The colonists had developed, over 150 years of relative autonomy, a fierce commitment to self-government and personal liberty. When the British government tried to assert direct control in the 1760s and 1770s, it violated something the colonists considered fundamental. They were willing to pay taxes, but only to their own legislatures. They were willing to obey laws, but only laws they consented to through representation. They were willing to accept British sovereignty in theory, but not British control in practice. The gap between these positions could not be bridged through compromise. Someone was going to have to yield completely, or there would be war. The British chose to enforce their authority through military power. The colonists chose to resist with violence. Both sides believed they were defending legitimate rights and principles. Both sides were convinced they would win quickly. Both sides were wrong about the quick victory, right about their willingness to fight to the end. The result was 8 years of brutal warfare that killed tens of thousands, destroyed property worth millions, split families, and created a new nation. On that cold April morning in 1775, none of this was clear. Captain Parker's farmers standing on Lexington Green probably thought they were just sending a message, not starting a war. Major Pitcairn soldiers probably thought they were just teaching rebels a lesson, not losing an empire. The smoke from their muskets dissipated in the morning breeze. The bodies were carried away. The blood was washed from the ground. But the consequences of those few minutes would reshape the world. That is what made the shot heard round the world. The battle that began at Lexington and continued to Concord was never really one battle. It was dozens of small skirmishes, hundreds of individual decisions, thousands of bullets fired by men who could barely see their targets. It was chaos given shape by subsequent narrative. But out of that chaos came clarity of a sort. Whatever ambiguity had existed before April 19th about whether the colonies would submit to British authority or fight for independence was resolved. The first shot answered the question. War had begun. Everything else followed from that moment, that sound, that irrevocable choice that no one could undo. The shot heard round the world was really thousands of shots, but they all said the same thing. We will not submit. We will fight. Whatever the cost, whatever the outcome, this is the path we choose. And America, as we know it, began.